214 guests filled the Mercer Ballroom on a Friday evening in Savannah, and Brian Mitchell knew none of them. He stood near the entrance in a borrowed blazer that pulled slightly across the shoulders, a glass of club soda in his right hand, Kate Sullivan beside him. The chandeliers threw light in every direction. Name badges caught the glow, titles printed beneath each one. Chief something, vice president of something else. A man in a charcoal suit crossed the floor toward them and stopped in front of Kate. "Miss Sullivan, the board is waiting for your opening remarks." Brian looked at her. She hadn't moved. He glanced up at the banner stretched above the stage. Sullivan Harwick Heritage Weekend. His grip on the glass loosened. Kate turned to him, and her mouth opened, but nothing came out. He had agreed to be her date for the weekend. He thought it was a dinner. Stay with this one, because the weekend hasn't actually started yet, and neither of them knows what it's going to cost before it's over. 3 days earlier, Brian Mitchell had been standing on a stepladder on Jones Street, scraping 90-year-old paint off a set of wooden shutters with a 5-in-1 tool and a patience that most people in his profession had stopped pretending to have. He was 38. He lived in a rented cottage on East Broad Street with his daughter Jenna, who was 9, and spent most afternoons reading on the porch swing while he cleaned brushes in the side yard. She was the kind of kid who could sit still for an hour without being told to. She had Ellen's concentration, that ability to drop into a book and stay there while the rest of the world went on without her. Brian had been painting houses in Savannah's historic district for almost 2 years. Word-of-mouth work, mostly residential, the kind of jobs where the homeowner stood on the sidewalk pointing at trim details that hadn't been touched since the Carter administration. It was steady enough to keep the lights on, small enough to never require a business card. Before Savannah, he had been a structural engineer. Lead structural engineer at Whitman Pryor in Atlanta, a firm that handled commercial high-rises and mixed-use towers across the Southeast. In the spring of 21, a developer had pushed a $60 million tower through the pipeline with a foundation design Brian knew was compromised. Insufficient bearing capacity. Cut corners on the deep pile specification. Brian flagged it in writing. Then he flagged it again in a meeting with 2 managing partners. Then he refused to sign the structural certification. The partners sat him down and explained that the developer's business represented 11% of the firm's annual revenue. They didn't fire Brian. They eliminated his position. His desk was cleared by Thursday. His wife, Ellen, died the following year. A car accident on the interstate, just past the Metter exit, on a Tuesday morning in March. It had nothing to do with the job. The timing made it feel like the same wound, but it wasn't. 2 separate collapses, one after the other, and by the time the second one hit, there was nothing structural left to hold. He moved to Savannah because Ellen had liked it there. They had driven down twice, both times in the fall when the squares turned golden under the live oaks. He started painting houses because a neighbor asked, and the work kept coming. On a Tuesday morning in late September, a woman knocked on his ladder. She had rented the house on Jones Street for the week and wanted the shutters and porch trim freshened up before a work event she was hosting that weekend. Her name was Kate Sullivan. She was 34, and she told him she worked in real estate, mostly office stuff, she said, the kind of thing that sounds boring at parties. She said it with a half smile that made Brian think she was testing whether he'd ask a follow-up. He didn't. Brian worked 3 days on the house. They talked in the way people talk when one of them is 10 feet up a ladder and the other is standing on the porch below, fragments, half-sentences, observations that didn't feel like conversation until you realized you'd been at it for 2 hours. She asked about the neighborhood. He told her about the ironwork on the corner of Bull and Gaston, the forge marks still visible if you caught them in the right light. She said she'd noticed them too. On Thursday evening, when he came down the ladder for the last time and started folding his drop cloths, Kate stepped out onto the porch and asked him something that had nothing to do with paint. She had a work event this weekend, Friday evening and Saturday during the day. She didn't want to go alone. Would he come with her? Just as company. Just for the weekend. Brian hesitated. He set the drop cloth on the porch rail and looked at his phone, then back at her. Jenna. Kate said it was just Friday night and Saturday. A dinner and a daytime thing. That was it. He called Mrs. Polk, his neighbor 2 doors down, a retired school librarian who had watched Jenna a dozen times before and always sent her home with a new book. Mrs. Polk said of course. Brian said yes. Friday morning, he dropped Jenna at Mrs. Polk's kitchen table with her backpack and a library book about sea turtles, kissed the top of her head, and drove across town to meet Kate. She picked him up on Drayton Street, and they headed to the Mercer Ballroom for what she called a setup walkthrough. To make sure the caterers had the room right, she said. Brian figured it was a dinner party, maybe a fundraiser. He didn't ask. The venue was a restored cotton warehouse from the 1890s, brick walls 2 feet thick, iron tie rods visible along the ceiling line where they braced the original masonry against the outward thrust of the roof, a mezzanine level added sometime in the last 20 years with steel framing bolted into the brick. Brian hadn't set foot in a building like this in a professional capacity in over 2 years, but his hands remembered before his head caught up. He ran his fingers along the exposed brick near the stairwell. He looked up at the iron plates bolted into the original tie rods and followed them visually to the bearing wall on the east side, tracing the load path the way he used to trace wiring on blueprints, automatically, without deciding to. Kate was speaking with a caterer near the stage when Brian stopped at the base of the mezzanine stairs. He tilted his head and studied the lateral bracing, 2 steel channels bolted to the original masonry, carrying the dead load of the added floor plus whatever live load the mezzanine was rated for. One of the anchor plates had a hairline gap between the bolt head and the face of the brick. Not dangerous, not immediate, but not right, either. It meant the bolt had either been undersized for the sheer load or the brick had shifted since installation. He turned to a man setting up speakers nearby. "Do you know when they added the mezzanine?" The man shrugged. Brian turned back to the bracing and asked Kate, without thinking about it, whether the lateral load path had been recalculated when the mezzanine was permitted, whether anyone had verified that the original masonry walls could handle the additional horizontal force from the new floor diaphragm. Kate stopped mid-sentence with the caterer. She looked at him. That was not a question a house painter asks. "I read a lot," Brian said. She held his gaze for a beat longer than normal, then went back to the caterer without pressing it. At 11:15, a man walked in through the side entrance. Charcoal suit, silver watch, a handshake that arrived before his smile did. Victor Haynes, 52, Chief Operating Officer of Sullivan Harwick. He crossed the ballroom, shook Kate's hand firmly, and turned to Brian with a glance that didn't quite complete itself, the kind of look that measures someone and decides their furniture. Victor mentioned the Oglethorpe Row project. 12 historic row houses on the south side of Oglethorpe Square, mid-conversion to mixed-use commercial and residential space. Phase 2 of construction was set to break ground on Monday. He said it the way people mention large things they want to sound casual about, dropped into the middle of a sentence about weekend logistics, as if 12 buildings and several $1 million were simply another item on the checklist. Brian drifted to the back wall, where a set of architectural renderings sat on an easel. Floor plans, elevation drawings, and in the lower right corner of the third board, a cross-section detail showing the footing depth and the load path down through the original brick piers. He studied it. The footing dimensions didn't look right for the soil type. The pier spacing was tight, tighter than it should have been for the converted load the upper floors would carry. And there was no notation for any geotechnical investigation, no boring log reference, no soil classification, nothing that connected the design to what was actually in the ground. His jaw tightened. He said nothing. Kate noticed him standing at the easel. She watched his face for a moment, the set of his mouth, the stillness in his posture. Then she turned back to Victor and didn't ask. Something was wrong with what Brian had seen in those drawings. And he was not the kind of man who said things before he was certain. That evening, the Mercer Ballroom was full. Brian stood near the entrance in the borrowed blazer, a navy blue sport coat that belonged to Mrs. Polk's late husband, slightly wide in the shoulders, slightly short in the sleeves. Kate stood beside him. 214 guests. Name badges with corporate titles. Waiters moved through the crowd with trays of wine and small plates. A string quartet played something Brian didn't recognize in the far corner. The man in the charcoal suit appeared and said the board was waiting. The banner above the stage read Sullivan Harwick Heritage Weekend, and Brian looked at it, then looked at her, and for 5 full seconds neither of them moved. Kate walked to the stage. She delivered her opening remarks, steady, precise, unhurried, the kind of voice that belongs to someone who has done this 100 times and still means it. She talked about preservation, about the responsibility of owning buildings that were standing before the people in the room were born, about what it means to build something that outlasts the builder. The room was quiet while she spoke. Brian stood near the back wall with his club soda and listened. He didn't know her last name was on the banner. He didn't know she'd built the company that was funding the renovation of an entire city block. He didn't know any of it, and the distance between what he'd assumed and what was real opened in front of him. Invisible until you knew where to look, and then impossible to unsee. People approached her after the speech. They shook her hand. They called her Miss Sullivan. One of the board members mentioned the Oglethorpe Row timeline, and Kate answered with the kind of precision that comes from knowing every number by heart. Brian watched from 15 feet away, holding his glass, and the room rearranged itself around a fact he hadn't had an hour ago. After her speech, he stepped out onto the terrace. The air was warm and thick with salt from the river. Spanish moss hung from the oaks along the sidewalk. Kate found him there a few minutes later. She stood beside him at the iron railing and didn't speak first. "You could have told me," he said. "Would you have come?" He didn't answer. He set both hands on the railing and looked out at the square. A horse carriage passed on Bull Street, the driver's voice carrying faintly across the sidewalk. Kate stood beside him in the silence, and neither of them tried to fill it. Across the ballroom, visible through the open terrace doors, Victor Haynes stood with a glass of bourbon and watched them. He set the glass down on a passing tray, took out his phone, and typed something short. Saturday morning, the group moved to the Oglethorpe Row site. Kate led the tour. 12 investors, 4 board members, Victor Haynes, 2 project managers, and Brian, who had no badge, no title, and no clear reason to be walking through the gutted interior of a 150-year-old row house at 8 in the morning except that the CEO had asked him to be there. The buildings were stripped to their bones. Exposed brick darkened by a century and a half of soot and settling. Original heart pine joists overhead, some bowed, some cracked, all of them bearing the marks of a structure that had been standing since before the Civil War. Scaffolding lined the interiors. The air smelled like old lime mortar and fresh-cut framing lumber, and if you stood still long enough you could hear the building ticking. The small, constant adjustments that old structures make as temperature and humidity shift through the day. Brian walked through each building without speaking. He ran his hand along the top of a joist in Building 2 and looked at the grain direction, checking for cross-grain cracking. In Building 3, he crouched at the base of a brick pier and looked at the mortar joints, soft, crumbling, repointed in some places and untouched in others. In Building 4, he stopped. Victor noticed. He leaned toward Kate. "Who is he?" "He's with me," Kate said. Her voice was level. She didn't elaborate. Victor pulled her aside near the entrance to Building 5. The board was watching, he said. She had brought an outsider, someone with no affiliation to Sullivan Harwick, onto an active construction site during an investor walkthrough. It wasn't a good look. He said it with the kind of deliberate concern that people use when they want a warning to sound like advice. Kate said nothing. She held his gaze for 3 seconds, then walked back to the group. Brian, standing alone in Building 4, had found what he was looking for. A header beam above the second-floor opening. A heavy timber member, roughly 8 by 12 inches, that carried the load from the wall above and transferred it to the brick columns on either side. The beam had a crack running along the grain for approximately 14 inches, originating from a notch where someone had cut into the bottom face to route new electrical conduit. The crack wasn't old. It was recent. The exposed wood inside the split was still light-colored, not oxidized, and it had been widened by the weight of the wall above pressing down on the weakened section. Brian crouched beneath the beam. He looked at the notch, then up at the wall it was carrying. He took 3 photographs with his phone, close-up of the crack, wide shot showing the beam in context, and one of the conduit notch with his hand beside it for scale. He stood up, put his phone in his back pocket, and walked out of Building 4 without saying a word to anyone. That afternoon, they sat on the porch of the Jones Street rental house. The light came through the live oaks in long slanted bars across the floorboards. Kate had her laptop open on the table beside her, but the screen had gone dark 10 minutes ago, and she hadn't touched it. Brian sat in the rocking chair across from her, elbows on his knees, hands folded loosely between them. He had been quiet since the site tour. Kate had noticed. He told her what he had seen. The header beam in Building 4, cracked along the grain from a conduit notch, carrying wall load above a second-floor opening, failure mode consistent with a bending stress concentration at the notch. The lateral bracing concern at the Mercer Ballroom, the hairline gap at the mezzanine anchor, suggesting either bolt undersize or masonry settlement, and the foundation cross-sections in the Oglethorpe Row renderings, which showed footing dimensions and pier spacing that didn't match what he'd observed when he crouched at the base of the piers that morning. Kate closed the laptop. She set it on the floor beside her chair and looked at him. "How do you know what you're looking at?" He told her. "All of it." Whitman Pryor, the structural engineering firm in Atlanta where he'd spent 9 years, the first 5 learning how buildings hold themselves up, the last 4 being the person responsible for certifying that they would. The $60 million residential tower with the compromised foundation. The written memo. The meeting with the partners. The certification he refused to sign. The glass-walled conference room where 2 men in good suits explained that 11% of annual revenue was worth more than one engineer's professional judgment. The position eliminated. The desk cleared by Thursday. He said it without anger. He said it the way a man describes a road he drove a long time ago, the landmarks still sharp. The emotional weather of the drive faded to something quieter. She was silent for a long time. The porch fan turned overhead, clicking on every third rotation where a blade was slightly off balance. A car passed on Jones Street with its windows down, and a bar of music swelled and faded as it went. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" she asked. "Because I was just supposed to be your date for the weekend." Kate picked up her phone from the arm of the chair. She dialed a number she didn't need to look up. Gail Redmond answered on the second ring, 61 years old, Kate's executive assistant for the past 14 years, the kind of woman who kept her phone on the nightstand and considered a missed call from Kate a personal failing. Kate asked Gail to pull the structural assessment reports for the Oglethorpe Row project. All 12 buildings. Every document filed in the last 18 months. Inspection reports, certification letters, soil analyses, anything with an engineer's seal on it. Gail was quiet for a moment. Then she said that those reports had been handled directly by Victor Haynes. He had managed the relationship with the assessment firm himself. No third-party peer review, no independent verification. He had submitted the certified reports to the Savannah Permitting Office without routing them through Sullivan Harwick's standard engineering review. She said she had flagged this to Victor's assistant in April. The assistant had told her it was taken care of. Kate set the phone down on the porch railing. She looked at Brian. "Something is off," she said. Brian nodded once. He already knew. Gail said she would pull everything she could access and drive down from Charleston. She could be there by 7. Saturday evening. The rental house on Jones Street. The kitchen table covered with paper. Gail Redmond arrived at 7:15 with 2 file boxes in her arms and a flash drive in her jacket pocket. She set the boxes on the kitchen table, sat down across from Kate and Brian, and opened the first folder. She had pulled everything she could find: assessment reports, the engagement contract with the assessment firm, internal emails from Victor's assistant, and the compensation records she had access to as the person who processed the quarterly bonus certifications. The structural assessment reports for Oglethorpe Row, all 12 buildings, had been prepared and signed by a firm called Denton Associates, licensed out of Atlanta. Each report bore the seal of a professional engineer named Carl Denton. The reports were dated between March and June of that year, covering the pre-construction assessment phase that was required before the city would issue conversion permits. Brian picked up the first report. He read the cover page. He turned to the methodology section, the part that describes how the engineer conducted the assessment, what they measured, what standards they applied. His hand stopped moving on the page. He knew the name. Denton Associates was the firm that had certified the compromised foundation on the $60 million tower in Atlanta, the same project Brian had refused to sign off on at Whitman Pryor. When Brian's refusal had created a gap in the certification chain, the developer had brought in Carl Denton specifically to fill it. Denton's seal had replaced Brian's refusal. The tower had been built. Brian had been gone by Thursday. He set the first report down and picked up the next one. Then the next. He read 5 of them in 40 minutes, sitting at the kitchen table under the overhead light, turning pages with the focused, unhurried precision of someone who has read 1,000 reports like these and knows exactly where the shortcuts hide. The language was templated, the same boilerplate phrasing repeated across all 12 buildings, the same methodology descriptions copied from one report to the next with only the street address changed. The soil analysis sections referenced test borings that didn't correspond to the actual building footprints. The load calculations used assumptions that didn't reflect the structural modifications Brian had observed on site. Walls removed, floors opened up, bearing conditions changed by the conversion work already underway. These weren't written from inspections, Brian said. They were written to pass. Kate looked at Gail. Gail opened a second folder. Internal compensation records she had pulled from Sullivan Harwick's shared drive before leaving Charleston that afternoon. Victor Haynes's performance bonus for the current fiscal year was tied directly to the Oglethorpe Row project timeline. The bonus structure had been approved by the Compensation Committee 18 months earlier, when the project was still in the planning phase. If Phase 2 of construction broke ground on schedule, Monday morning, Victor would trigger a performance incentive payment of $2.1 million. But the money was only part of it. Gail turned to a second page, a set of proxy agreements. 3 members of the Sullivan Harwick board had committed their voting proxies to Victor, contingent on the Oglethorpe Row project hitting its construction milestones on time. With those 3 proxies, Victor would hold enough votes to call a formal leadership review, the procedural mechanism by which the board could remove the CEO. Kate's hand flattened on the table. She stared at the proxy agreements for a long time. The kitchen was quiet. The only sound was the ticking of the ceiling fan and the faint hum of the refrigerator against the far wall. Victor wasn't just rushing the project. He was using fraudulent structural assessments to meet a construction deadline that would personally enrich him by $2.1 million and hand him the board votes he needed to push Kate out of her own company. Brian sat back in his chair. He looked at Kate. Then he looked at the stack of Denton reports on the table. The same firm, the same shortcuts, the same willingness to certify whatever the client needed certified, regardless of what was actually in the ground. "I've seen this before," he said. "I lost my career over it. You're about to lose your company." Sunday morning, the last day of the weekend, Kate called an emergency session of the Sullivan Harwick Board of Directors for 3 o'clock that afternoon. She reserved the conference room at the DeSoto Hotel on Madison Square, neutral ground, away from the Oglethorpe Row site and the Mercer Ballroom. She contacted each board member individually. She did not tell them the subject of the meeting. She said only that it was urgent and that she was exercising her authority under Article 9 of the company bylaws, which allowed the CEO to convene a special session with 6 hours' notice. Victor learned about the meeting within the hour. He called Kate's cell phone at 9:40. His voice was measured, almost pleasant, the tone of a man who has learned that the most effective threats are the ones that sound like advice. He told Kate that questioning the Oglethorpe Row timeline would unsettle the investors, that the board would not appreciate a CEO who manufactured uncertainty during a weekend designed to build confidence. He suggested she reconsider before she created a problem that didn't need to exist. Kate listened. She did not respond. She ended the call. Brian sat at the kitchen table in the Jones Street rental with the 12 Denon reports arranged in front of him in 2 rows of 6. He went through each one line by line, marking every discrepancy with a red pen: soil classifications that didn't match the Chatham County Geological Survey data, load path calculations that ignored documented structural modifications, bearing capacity numbers that appeared in identical form across buildings with completely different foundation types. In Building 7, Denton had listed the soil classification as GP, poorly graded gravel. Brian had crouched at the foundation of Building 7 the day before. The soil was silted clay. The classification wasn't just wrong. It was physically impossible for the location, and anyone who had actually set foot on the site would have known it. By noon, he had written a 6-page technical summary. At the top of the first page, beneath the title Independent Structural Assessment Summary, Oglethorpe Row, he listed his credentials: Brian T. Mitchell, P. Georgia license number 4712. Active. Current. He had renewed it every 2 years since leaving Whitman prior. The continuing education hours, the renewal fee, the ethics attestation. He had never let it lapse. Kate stood in the kitchen doorway with a cup of coffee and watched him write the last page. "You kept your license," she said. Brian didn't look up. "Because I didn't do anything wrong." They did. Gail confirmed one last detail by early afternoon. She had located the original engagement contract between Sullivan Harwick and Denton Associates, the document that authorized Denton to perform the structural assessments. It had been signed by Victor Haynes personally. There was no board resolution authorizing the engagement. No procurement committee review. No competitive bid process. Victor had hired Carl Denton on his own authority, outside the company's standard vendor qualification and approval process, and filed the contract in a subfolder of his personal directory on the company's server, not in the project archive where engineering contracts were supposed to be stored. Brian set his pen down. He looked at Kate. She looked at Gail. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The DeSoto Hotel conference room had a long walnut table, 12 leather chairs, and tall windows that looked out onto Madison Square. 6 board members sat on one side. Victor Haynes sat at the far end. Kate Sullivan stood at the head of the table. Brian Mitchell sat in a chair against the wall, a manila folder on his lap. Kate began without preamble. She placed the 12 Denton Associates assessment reports on the table. She walked the board through the discrepancies, the templated language, the recycled soil data, the bearing capacity figures that were identical across buildings with different foundation systems, the load calculations that didn't account for the structural modifications already underway. She showed them the photographs Brian had taken at the building 4 site, the cracked header beam, the conduit notch that had initiated the failure, the foundation corner where the new concrete underpinning didn't align with the original brick pier geometry. She presented Victor's compensation structure, the $2.1 million bonus tied to the Monday groundbreaking. She presented the proxy agreements, 3 board members who had pledged their votes to Victor contingent on the Oglethorpe Row timeline. And she presented the engagement contract with Denton Associates, signed solely by Victor Haynes, with no board authorization, no procurement review, and no record in the company's project archive. Brian's 6-page technical summary was entered into the record as independent supporting documentation. Victor sat at the opposite end of the table. He had listened with his hands folded, his expression level, his posture suggesting a man watching a presentation he had already decided to disagree with. When Kate finished, he leaned forward. "This is a house painter," he said. He gestured toward Brian without turning his head. "A man with a personal grievance against a firm that no longer employs him. This is not a credible basis for halting a project that has taken this company 18 months and $14 million to bring to this point." Kate looked at Victor. Then she looked at the board. "He's a licensed structural engineer," she said. "He lost his career because he refused to certify the same kind of work you are now asking this company to stand behind. That is not a grievance. That is a track record." The room was silent. One of the board members picked up Brian's technical summary and turned to the second page, the soil classification comparison. Another board member pulled the Denton contract toward her and studied the signature line. A third looked at the proxy agreements and then looked at Victor. The vote was 5-2. Oglethorpe Row was halted immediately pending a full independent structural assessment by a firm with no prior relationship to Denton Associates, Victor Haynes, or Sullivan Harwick's existing vendor pool. Victor was suspended from his position as Chief Operating Officer effective that afternoon, pending a formal investigation into the Denton engagement, the proxy arrangements, and the bonus structure. Victor stood. He buttoned his jacket. He pushed his chair neatly under the table. He walked out of the conference room without speaking, and the door closed behind him with the soft click of a latch that didn't need to be forced. Brian drove home that evening with the windows cracked. The air had cooled. September in Savannah still held heat during the day, but by 7 o'clock the river pushed something cooler through the streets. He pulled into the driveway on East Broad, walked up the porch steps, and knocked on Mrs. Polk's door. Jenna was sitting at the kitchen table with a plate of apple slices and her sea turtle book open to a chapter about nesting patterns on Cumberland Island. She looked up when he came in, slid off the chair, and walked over to him. He crouched down, and she put her arms around his neck the way she always did, brief, firm, already letting go before he was ready. "Did you have a good weekend?" she asked. Brian stood up. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at his daughter. She was watching him with the same quiet, measuring expression she'd had since she was 4, the one that always made him feel like she understood more than she was willing to say. "Yeah," he said. "I think I did." His phone buzzed in the jacket pocket. He pulled it out. Kate. She was still at the DeSoto. The board had stayed for another hour after the vote. They had discussed next steps. They needed a full independent structural review of all 12 Oglethorpe Row buildings before any construction could resume. A real assessment, conducted on site, by a licensed engineer with no prior relationship to Denton Associates, or to Victor Haynes. The board wanted to engage Brian. "I don't have a firm," Brian said. He was standing in Mrs. Polk's kitchen with his daughter's backpack in one hand and his phone in the other. "You have a license," Kate said. "A reputation. And you were the only person in that room today who told the truth without being asked." He was quiet. The kitchen light from Mrs. Polk's house fell across the side yard in a yellow rectangle. Somewhere down East Broad, a dog barked twice and stopped. Jenna tugged the cuff of his jacket. "Who's on the phone?" Brian looked down at his daughter. Her sea turtle book was tucked under her arm. She was waiting, not impatient, just present, the way she always was. He looked at Jenna for a long moment. Then he said into the phone, "Let me think about it." 3 weeks later, Brian Mitchell submitted his independent structural assessment of the Oglethorpe Row project to the Sullivan-Harwick Board of Directors. The report ran 114 pages, 12 buildings, each one surveyed floor by floor, foundation to roof, with measurements taken by hand, crack monitors installed at 6 critical locations, and photographic documentation of every deficiency. He had worked 16 days straight, starting at 7 each morning when the construction crew would have been arriving and finishing each evening when the light through the west-facing windows went amber and then gray. The findings confirmed what he had suspected since the first morning on site. Buildings 3, 4, and 7 required significant foundation remediation before any conversion work could safely proceed. In Building 4, the cracked header beam he had photographed on Saturday was a symptom, not the primary issue. The primary issue was below, a footing that had been partially excavated during a utility trench installation 6 months earlier, reducing the bearing area by nearly 30%. Denton Associates had not flagged this. Their assessment for Building 4 referenced a footing in its original condition. It had not been in its original condition since March. In Building 7, the soil beneath the existing footings was silted clay with a low bearing capacity. Exactly the kind of soil that requires wider footings, deeper piers, or both. Denton's report listed the soil as poorly graded gravel and used bearing values that were more than 3 times what the actual soil could support. If Phase 2 had begun on Monday as scheduled, the first heavy equipment on site would have started loading a foundation that was already near its limit. Brian's report saved Sullivan-Harwick from a structural failure that would have surfaced the moment the converted buildings were occupied, if not sooner. It also saved them from the legal and financial consequences of building on top of work that had been certified by a firm whose business model was telling clients what they wanted to hear. On a Thursday afternoon in mid-October, Kate Sullivan drove to Savannah. She did not call ahead. She did not bring files or contracts or board resolutions or anything that required a signature. She came alone, in a rental car from the Charleston airport, and parked on Jones Street in front of the house Brian had painted 5 weeks earlier. He was on the porch. The homeowner had liked his work and hired him back. The window casings on the second floor, the dental molding under the eaves, a few sections of clapboard on the north side where the old paint had started to peel. He was standing on the top step of his extension ladder with a 2-inch angled brush in his hand when he heard the car door close below. He looked down. Kate stood on the brick sidewalk. She looked up at him with one hand raised against the afternoon sun. She didn't say anything. He came down the ladder. He balanced the brush across the open paint can and wiped his hands on the rag tucked into his back pocket. He took his time. She waited. Jenna was on the porch, curled into the wicker chair with her legs crossed underneath her and a book about horseshoe crabs open in her lap. She looked up when Kate came through the gate, recognized her, and went back to reading. The way a child accepts the presence of someone who has already been placed in the category of people who belong. Kate walked up the porch steps and sat down on the top stair. Brian sat down beside her. The live oaks on Jones Street threw long afternoon shadows across the brick sidewalk and the iron fence and the front garden where the homeowner grew rosemary in clay pots. Somewhere down the block, a sprinkler ticked against a wooden fence in a slow, steady rhythm. "You didn't have to come down here," Brian said. "I know," Kate said. They sat. The afternoon light moved across the porch in degrees. Jenna turned a page. The paint can sat on the drop cloth at the foot of the ladder, the lid still off, the angled brush balanced across the rim. Waiting, the way a job waits when the person doing it has found something more important to sit with for a while. The weekend had ended 3 weeks ago. Neither of them had corrected the arrangement.